Mr. President, today, the members of the Security Council have been proposed to discuss an incident on Polish soil which took place on the evening of 9 to 10 September. According to the reports from the Polish Operational Command, in the airspace of that state, more than a dozen unmanned aerial vehicles entered that airspace. It has been announced that part of them have been neutralized by air defense systems. A home in Lublinsk region was damaged, and there were no casualties. Warsaw recognized that the drones could have flown in from the territory of Ukraine. At the same time, Poland they hastily pinned blame on Russia without presenting any evidence whatsoever. We think it is important to analyze the real magnitude of the consequences of the incident and to compare this with the political clickbait which is being advanced by Polish and other European politicians, as well as to pose additional questions about the versions that have been circulating about what transpired. On the 10th of September, Warsaw published data about fragments of drones that fell, and specifically a photograph was demonstrated of a roof of a home that had been damaged. However, any military expert will confirm that if this indeed was an explosion of a drone warhead weighing tens of kilograms, the consequences would have been different. Here, what took place was a localized damage, more likely a consequence of falling wreckage. Furthermore, later, the Polish authorities were indeed compelled to acknowledge that they did not find drone warheads on their territory. Equally telling is another incident with a device that was found in an agricultural field. Apparently, it simply veered off course and fell, and this indeed could have been the consequence of a technical malfunction or the result of the use of Ukrainian radio-electronic warfare means. Now, turning to actions by the Russian Federation. On the 10th of September, that evening, the Russian armed forces carried out long-range, land-based, sea-based, and air-based high-precision weapon strikes, as well as drone strikes targeting military-industrial facilities on the territory of Ukraine, where there was manufacturing and maintenance facilities for armored and aviation equipment of the UAF, as well as engines and electronic parts for this. There were no targets marked on Polish territory. The maximum range of the drones used in this strike did not exceed 700 kilometers, which makes it physically impossible for them to have reached Polish territory. Despite the obvious baselessness of the allegations levied against us, in order to provide for comprehensive and objective elucidation of what took place, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation expressed a willingness to engage in professional dialogue and consultations with the Ministry of Defense of Poland. The Russian Foreign Ministry, in turn, also stands ready to engage in this work if the Polish side indeed is interested in reducing tensions rather than fomenting tensions. We call upon Polish colleagues to take advantage of these proposals rather than engaging in megaphone diplomacy at multilateral platforms. We have already repeatedly stated that we are not interested in escalating tensions with Warsaw, and we repeat that today. What warrants separate mention is a constructive and responsible approach of the Belarusian side in the context of what transpired. The relevant organs of the Republic of Belarus, through the relevant mechanisms, promptly informed Polish colleagues about existing risks, having demonstrated a responsible approach and a willingness to engage in cooperation. This is a policy which is based on exchange of objective information, coordination of action, and it should serve as an example for a good faith conduct amid such incidents. Mr. President, unfortunately, the reaction to the incident in Polish and European political establishment and media outlets gives rise, under these circumstances, to significant questions. The head of EU diplomacy, Kaja Kallas, without having awaited official conclusions, rushed to make loud statements about the alleged deliberate violation of Polish airspace, advancing her favorite talking point about investments in European defense, that is, continuation of the militarization thereof. of hysterical outbursts about the alleged aggression from the Russian Federation is also heard from other European capitals. This is all very similar to the information campaign, the goal of which is to maintain the level of external mobilization around Ukraine and to continue to egg on allies to continue to provide new and new weapons. In this vein, we would be well advised to recall the incident which occurred in Przewód in November 2022, when, as a result of the fall of a missile, 2 Polish citizens died. At that point, tensions were also being ignited. However, 1 year later, the General Prosecutor and the Minister of Justice Zbigniew Zerbo recognized that both the launch location and the ownership of the missile were Ukrainian. And the former president of Poland, Andrzej Duda, in an interview with the journalist Bogdan Romanowski, recently explicitly recognized that at that point the Kiev regime was attempting to pressure Warsaw to levy accusations against Russia. According to him, this was a deliberate attempt to draw Poland and consequently NATO into an armed conflict. This candid comment from the Polish politician is an important recognition, which is not being quoted by European newspapers nor discussed it in national parliaments, but we think it is important today to remind you of this. We are talking about a desire of Kiev to at all costs engage in the confrontation with Russia. More and more states. It is no secret that Ukraine has long been consistently attempting to expand the geography of the conflict with no regard for the consequences of such an escalation. The Polish authorities, for all of these years, in an anti-Russian frenzy, were willing to support any, regardless of how criminal, regardless of how reckless, any actions of the Kiev regime, and were eagerly indulging it, hoping to harm the Russian Federation using its hands. Unfortunately, the Polish authorities are not drawing any conclusions, and they're continuing to engage in a policy of escalation in Europe. For example, at the pretext of conducting a joint Russian-Belarusian exercises, the West Zapad 2025, the Polish authorities already announced the closure of the border with Belarus, and they announced the intention to deploy to that area up to 40,000 military personnel. Let us recall that our above-mentioned strategic exercises are defensive in nature. They do not pose any threat for any neighboring country. And the representatives of OSCE countries, including Poland, have been invited to observe them. However, the decision was taken, the border is closed, and the victims of this decision are ordinary citizens whose freedom of movement has been denied. In any conflict, when we are talking about provocations, the key question remains unchanged. Who does this benefit? The response here is obvious. All of this artificially blown up hysteria is beneficial exclusively to the head of the Kiev regime and the European Party of War, who are desperately trying to derail prospects for Ukrainian resolution, which began to take shape as a result of the Russian-US contacts in August. It is evident that Zelensky is now the main opponent to a political resolution of the Ukrainian crisis, which will uncover his illegitimacy. Without the conflict, the justification for the legal vacuum will disappear. This justification, which he is using to cling to power in circumvention of constitutional procedures, even according to the data of Ukrainian sociological centers, Zelensky's ratings are falling precipitously, as is the level of trust in him. In this context, the unabated military actions, hostilities, are a tool for political survival of the Ukrainian regime. Against the backdrop of this, what is becoming clear is the level of despair prompting the Kiev authorities to throw remnants of the people forcibly mobilized into battle, or more accurately, to slaughter, despite the colossal losses and skyrocketing desertion rates. Official data for 2025 shows that more than 140,000 criminal cases have been initiated for soldiers who abandoned their units. The overall figures for desertion since the start of the conflict are nearing 266,000 people. The effective stabbing levels in combat units at 50% is viewed as a success, and the real losses exceeding 15 to 20,000 people per month has long ago outstripped the pace of mobilization. People no longer wish to die for a corrupt leadership which long ago has ceased to represent the interest of society. The head of the UAF, Syrsky, recently recognized that Russia has a threefold advantage in manpower and capabilities, and in the main areas has a 4 to 6-fold advantage. This is a frank recognition of failure and essentially an indictment of the current military political policy. And this is precisely why Zelensky today is willing to do anything at all to maintain this conflict in the active phase, even if this may give rise to threats, if this means simulating threats, exaggerating consequences, or, as was the case in Przewod, manipulating any incident in order to drag NATO countries into the war. What is noteworthy is how easily the head of the Kiev regime recants his own loud statements as soon as they no longer advance his political interests. In recent months, he invoked slogans about the supposed intention to engage in dialogue. However, the direct, unambiguous proposal from the Russian president to visit our capital to discuss the whole gamut of issues related to Ukrainian resolution was rejected by him under the pretext of the inadmissibility and the inability to travel, quote, while his country is under attack. And yet, as we see, there have been no attacks which prevented him from trekking to European capitals for 3+ years and making demands for more weapons deliveries and increased military assistance. Because in those capitals, the discussion is about continuing the war and this is completely in line with his interests. As soon as a real opportunity for peace emerged, with a visit to with a White House leader taking office who is willing to deal with the root causes of the crisis and to seek a lasting solution, Zelensky immediately began to renounce the previously announced peace initiative. This merely bears out what we were pointing to from the very start. The Kiev regime never had any intention to embrace peace, and everything that the regime is doing is to prolong the conflict, to cling to power, and to continue to take advantage of his Western sponsors. Weapons deliveries, sanctions misadventures, and Brussels propagandistic hysteria do not bring peace any closer, but rather entrenches the illusion in Kiev that they will manage to change the reality. However, it is not possible to change the reality. Every new month of hostilities merely brings the regime closer to collapse and raises the cost of resolution. The Russian Federation remains wedded to a responsible approach. We are open to constructive cooperation with everybody who genuinely is focused on de-escalation and establishment of peace in Europe, not pursuing the conflict for the sake of parochial political advantages. Thank you.
Excellencies, I'd like to begin by thanking the Republic of Korea for convening today's meeting and Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her excellent briefing. I also want to thank representatives of many Security Council members for your words, but also actions of support and solidarity with Poland. Allow me to start with a quote. "The merchants of death are unbothered by the fact that their weapons methodically, deliberately, and intentionally hit civilian targets. The blood of dozens of dead civilians is on the hands and conscience of those who arm the regime." End of quote. Thus spoke Sergei Lavrov, Russian foreign minister, here in this very room at the UN Security Council meeting on Ukraine a year ago. Russian officials have repeatedly accused others, primarily Ukraine and its allies, of engaging in terrorist attacks by using drones to target non-military infrastructure. The opposite is true. In fact, it is Russia that uses these weapons against civilians. Events in Poland just 2 days ago prove once again every Russian accusation eventually turns out to be a confession. Today, for the very first time in history, emergency meeting of UN Security Council was called upon a Polish request. We did that, we asked for that, to declare that the sky over Poland, my country, a sovereign state, has been deliberately violated by Russia. On the night of September 9th and 10th, 19 Russian military drones flying over the territory of both Ukraine and Belarus breached Polish airspace, thus trespassing borders of Poland, of NATO, and of the European Union. Such incidents happened before, but this time we know that that was the first time since the beginning of Russian full-scale invasion on Ukraine in 2022 that Polish territorial integrity has been purposely violated on such an unprecedented scale. We know, and I repeat, we know that it was not a mistake. Poland, together with allied Dutch, German, and Italian military forces, acted calmly, professionally, and decisively, executing our right to defend territorial integrity. The drones that threatened Polish citizens and critical infrastructure were shot down preemptively. Drones are instruments of terror that have shattered homes and communities across Ukraine. 2 days ago, they tried to target Polish homes. This is one of them in a village called Wyryki in eastern Poland. A representative of the Russian Federation claimed that maybe these were not Russian drones. This is the evidence of that, including signs in Russian on the parts of the drone. I don't want to spend too much of your precious time on the Orwellian or neo-Orwellian language of our Russian colleague, combined with blatant lies. But let me just draw your attention into one factor. He kept repeating that the reason of this, again, neo-Orwellian phrase, alleged aggression, which caused, as he himself admitted, hundreds of thousands of innocent victims so far. The cause of it was illegitimate regime or fascist regime. You know, we in the region remember the same kind of rhetoric by Russian diplomats when Russia, then Soviet Russia, attacked Czechoslovakia in 1968, Hungary in 1956, or Poland, together with Nazi Germany in September 1939 after the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. The fact is that in the region, among the neighbors of Russia, everybody is free, prosperous, and happy when there are no Russian troops on this country's soil. And one can only hope that Ukraine will be liberated from Russia's forces and will follow the suit, the history of Poland, Baltic states, Czechia, Slovakia, and Hungary. Ladies and gentlemen, Russia wants to set the region on fire. Here, in this chamber, sits a permanent member of Security Council as a judge in its own case, violating the UN Charter of which this very country should serve as defender and warrantor. We call upon the Council to respond to Russian criminal actions with unified, unequivocal and immediate condemnation. Condemnation that should serve as a critical preventive measure to de-escalate the situation and deter further acts of this kind. As for Russia, we expect to take full responsibility for this unjustified act, to fully explain the reasons for the intrusion, and to take all necessary measures so such incidents will not repeat in the future. One more important thought. You know, our Russian colleague called it possibly malfunction, or mistake, or coincidence. You know, once or twice it can be a coincidence or malfunction, but not 19 times, not 19 intrusions conducted within 7 hours. And not only those drones, those Russian military drones, flew through the airspace of Ukraine. They also, which your ally, President Lukashenko, admitted, were flown through Belarusian airspace. The way to achieve stability and peace in the region is simple. Russia must stop its barbaric war against Ukraine. Poland will not be intimidated. Our resolve to stand with Ukraine and defend the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity remains unwavering. Thank you all very much.